When Ezra Old Bones Whitmore gave away his last can of beans to a starving Apache boy on that bitterly cold November evening in 1884, he had no idea that single act of kindness would transform his failing ranch into something that defied everything the Arizona Territory had ever seen. But sometimes the smallest gestures of mercy can move mountains, change hearts, and prove that humanity transcends every boundary that men try to build between themselves. Ezra Whitmore was 73 years old and dying slowly, not from any particular disease, but from the accumulated weight of a hard life lived in an unforgiving land that had taken everything from him piece by piece. His back was bent from decades of breaking wild mustangs and mending endless miles of fence under the scorching Arizona sun. His hands were gnarled with arthritis that made every simple task a painful ordeal, from milking his one remaining cow to splitting firewood for the bitter desert nights. His weathered face bore the deep lines of a man who had spent most of his life squinting into blinding desert sun and bitter wind that could strip paint from wood. The sun had burned his skin to leather, and the wind had carved furrows around his eyes that spoke of countless dawns spent watching for storms, predators, and 100 other dangers that threatened a man trying to make a living from unforgiving land. But it was his eyes that told the real story, pale blue eyes that had once sparkled with hope and determination, but now held a sadness so deep it seemed to have no bottom. Those eyes had seen too much loss, too much failure, too many dreams buried in the rocky soil of a land that gave nothing easily and took everything greedily. They were the eyes of a man who had spent 30 years believing that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle, only to learn that sometimes the land wins no matter how hard you fight. Ezra's ranch sat in a narrow valley about 40 miles east of Tucson, a piece of land that had never been particularly good for much of anything except breaking men's spirits and emptying their pockets. The soil was thin and rocky, scattered with stones that seemed to multiply every time he cleared a field. The grass was sparse and tough, barely adequate to support the few cattle that hadn't already died from drought, disease, or predation. Water was always a problem, with a creek that ran strong in spring but dwindled to a trickle by summer and sometimes disappeared entirely during the worst dry spells. He bought the spread 30 years earlier with money saved from his days as a cavalry scout, back when he still believed that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle nature could throw at a man. The land had cost him $800, which represented every penny he'd managed to save during 10 years of guiding Army patrols through Apache country and dodging bullets for $30 a month. In those early days, Ezra had grand plans for his little valley. He would build it into a thriving ranch, raise the finest cattle in the territory, maybe even start a small town where other settlers could come to build their own dreams. He had surveyed every acre, planned irrigation systems, and even drawn up sketches for the big house he would build when the ranch started turning a profit. But the desert had worn him down year by year, taking everything he cared about and leaving him with nothing but memories and regrets. The irrigation systems had failed when flash floods washed away his carefully constructed channels. The cattle he'd imported from Texas had sickened and died in the high desert climate. The crops he'd planted had withered in the alkaline soil, despite his best efforts to improve it with expensive fertilizers he couldn't afford. His wife, Sarah, had died of consumption 8 years ago, coughing her life away in their modest cabin while Ezra held her hand and watched helplessly as the woman he loved slowly faded before his eyes. She had been his anchor, his reason for believing that all the struggle and hardship would eventually pay off. Sarah had possessed an unshakable faith that their little ranch would prosper, that their dreams would come true if they just kept working and hoping. They'd never had children, despite trying for 20 years and consulting every doctor within 100 miles. Sarah had blamed herself, carrying that burden of perceived failure until it became another weight on her already fragile health. Ezra had tried to convince her that it didn't matter, that they had each other, and that was enough, but he could see the longing in her eyes every time they encountered families with children. The consumption had taken her slowly, giving them months to say goodbye, but also making every day a reminder of what they were losing. Ezra had spent their savings on medicine that didn't work and doctors who shook their heads and offered empty reassurances. In the end, Sarah had died holding his hand and whispering that she was sorry for leaving him alone in such a hard place. Sarah's death had left Ezra completely alone in a world that seemed to grow more hostile with each passing season. Without her voice to encourage him, without her faith to sustain him, the ranch felt more like a prison than a home. He continued working because work was all he knew, but the joy had gone out of it completely. His cattle had dwindled from a herd of 200 to maybe 30 mangy steers that barely produced enough income to keep him in beans and coffee. The worst part wasn't the poverty or the loneliness, though both were constant companions. The worst part was the knowledge that he'd wasted his life on a dream that was never going to come true. Ezra had believed that if he worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, and never gave up, he could build something lasting in this harsh land. Instead, he'd built nothing but a monument to futility, a broken-down ranch that would die with him and be forgotten before his bones were cold. November of 1884 was particularly brutal, even by Arizona standards. An early winter storm had swept down from Colorado, bringing temperatures that dropped below freezing for the first time anyone could remember in that part of the territory. The storm had dumped 3 feet of snow across the region, an unprecedented amount that caught everyone unprepared. The snow had killed what little grass remained from the summer grazing, burying it under a blanket of white that might not melt until spring. Ezra had been feeding his cattle hay from his rapidly dwindling supply, watching helplessly as his small herd grew thinner with each passing day. The hay had cost him most of his remaining money, and he knew that when it ran out, both he and his animals would face starvation. He calculated that he had maybe 2 weeks' worth of feed left, barely enough to keep his cattle alive until the worst of winter passed, assuming he could make it that long himself. The storm had also brought something far more dangerous than cold and snow. Wolves had come down from the mountains, great gray shadows that moved like ghosts through the white landscape. These weren't the smaller coyotes that Ezra had dealt with for years, nuisances that might take the occasional calf, but could be driven off with gunshots and shouting. These were true wolves, animals that had been driven from their traditional hunting grounds by the harsh weather and were now desperate enough to attack full-grown cattle. Ezra had already lost 5 steers to the wolf packs, and he knew he'd lose more before winter ended. Each morning brought fresh signs of predation, tracks in the snow, scattered bones, and the nervous lowing of cattle that could smell death in the wind. At his age, with his failing eyesight and arthritic hands that could barely hold a rifle steady, Ezra couldn't guard his herd effectively. The wolves seemed to sense his weakness, growing bolder with each successful kill. On the evening of November 15th, Ezra was sitting in his cabin, trying to make his meager supplies last another day, when he heard something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the howling of wolves or the lowing of cattle in distress. It was something far more dangerous in the Arizona territory of 1884, the sound of someone approaching on foot through the snow. Ezra reached for his old Spencer rifle and moved carefully to the window. What he saw confused him more than it frightened him. A figure was stumbling through the snow toward his cabin, moving in the unsteady gait of someone who was either drunk or exhausted. As the figure got closer, Ezra could see it was a young person, small and thin, wrapped in what looked like traditional Apache clothing. For a moment, Ezra's finger tightened on the trigger. Relations between white settlers and the Apache had been tense for decades, marked by raids, reprisals, and mutual mistrust that ran so deep it seemed impossible to bridge. But as the figure collapsed just 20 feet from his door, Ezra realized this wasn't a warrior or a threat. It was a child, maybe 10 or 11 years old, and clearly in desperate need of help. Ezra set down his rifle and stepped outside into the bitter cold. The child was unconscious, breathing shallowly, with lips that were turning blue from exposure. Despite his arthritis and his general weakness, Ezra managed to carry the boy into his cabin and lay him down near the fire. As he removed the child's wet clothing and wrapped him in blankets, Ezra could see that the boy was severely malnourished, probably hadn't eaten in days. The child's clothes told a story that Ezra recognized all too well. They were traditional Apache garments, but they were worn and patched, the kind of clothing worn by people who had lost everything and were struggling just to survive. This wasn't the son of a war chief or a prosperous family. This was a refugee, probably from one of the reservation camps where conditions were notoriously harsh. As the boy began to warm up, he regained consciousness and immediately tried to flee. His dark eyes were wide with terror, and he spoke rapidly in Apache, words that Ezra couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear enough. The child expected to be hurt, maybe killed, and was begging for mercy. Ezra knelt down beside the boy and spoke in the calmest voice he could manage. "Easy there, son. Nobody's going to hurt you. You're safe here." The boy didn't understand the words, but something in Ezra's tone seemed to calm him slightly. He stopped struggling, but remained tense to run at the first sign of danger. Ezra looked at the child's thin face and hollow cheeks, and he made a decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew his circumstances. He had exactly 1 can of beans left in his pantry, his last meal, before facing starvation himself. He opened the can, heated the beans over his fire, and offered them to the Apache boy. The child stared at the food with desperate hunger, but didn't reach for it. Perhaps he thought it was a trap, or perhaps his pride wouldn't allow him to accept charity from an enemy. Ezra understood the hesitation. He'd felt the same way many times in his life, torn between need and dignity. "Go ahead, boy," Ezra said gently. "You need this more than I do." To prove his intentions, Ezra took a small spoonful of the beans and ate them himself, then handed the rest to the child. The boy's resolve crumbled in the face of his overwhelming hunger, and he devoured the beans as if he hadn't eaten in a week, which was probably true. After the boy finished eating, Ezra gave him a cup of water and watched as some color returned to his pale cheeks. The child was still wary, still ready to run, but the immediate panic had faded. They sat together in the small cabin, an old cowboy and a young Apache, separated by language and culture, but united by their shared humanity. As the night wore on, the boy gradually relaxed. He even smiled once when Ezra showed him a carved wooden horse that he'd made years ago as a potential gift for the children he and Sarah had never had. The child examined the carving with obvious delight, running his small fingers over the smooth wood and making soft sounds of appreciation. When morning came, the boy was gone. Ezra woke to find the cabin empty except for the wooden horse, which had been carefully placed on the table beside his bed. The child had vanished as silently as he'd appeared, leaving no trace except for the knowledge that Ezra had probably saved a young life at the cost of his own survival. Ezra spent that day taking inventory of his remaining supplies and trying to figure out how to stretch nothing into something. He had no food left except for a small bag of coffee and some hardtack that was so stale it could probably be used as building material. His cattle were dying, his body was failing, and winter was just beginning. For the first time in his life, Ezra Whitmore seriously considered giving up. But the next morning brought something that changed everything. Ezra woke to the sound of voices outside his cabin, dozens of voices speaking in Apache. His first thought was that he was about to be massacred, payment for some real or imagined grievance against his people. He reached for his rifle and moved to the window, expecting to see war paint and hostile warriors. Instead, he saw something that defied belief. Nearly 200 Apache men, women, and children were scattered across his property, and they were working. Some were repairing his broken fences, others were tending to his cattle, and still others were hauling supplies from travois and pack horses. It was like watching an army of angels descended from heaven to restore his failing ranch. At the center of the activity stood a tall Apache man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He approached Ezra's cabin slowly, his hands visible and empty, in a universal gesture of peaceful intentions. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear. "I am Chief Standing Bearer of the Chiricahua Apache. You saved the life of my grandson yesterday. We have come to repay that debt." Ezra stepped outside, still clutching his rifle, but no longer pointing it at anyone. "I don't understand. I just gave a hungry boy some food. Anyone would have done the same." Chief Standing Bear studied Ezra's face carefully. "No, old man. Not anyone would have done the same. Most of your people would have driven him away or worse. You gave him your last food. knowing that you would go hungry because of your kindness. Such generosity deserves to be repaid. Over the next 3 days, Ezra watched in amazement as the Apache transformed his ranch from a failing homestead into something that resembled the prosperous spread he'd dreamed of 30 years earlier. They brought lumber from somewhere, probably their own carefully hoarded supplies, and rebuilt his sagging barn with techniques that made the structure stronger than it had ever been. The Apache men worked with tools that were both traditional and practical, using methods that had been refined over generations of living in harsh environments. They hauled hay from hidden caches in the mountains, places where Apache families had stored winter supplies following ancient patterns of preparation and survival. They filled his storage areas with enough feed to last his cattle through the worst of winter and beyond. The hay was of better quality than anything Ezra had been able to afford, sweet-smelling grass that had been cut at just the right time and cured to perfection. They brought cattle to replace the ones he'd lost to wolves and weather, strong animals that were clearly adapted to desert conditions. These weren't ordinary range cattle, but animals that had been carefully bred over generations to thrive in the Arizona climate. The Apache explained that their people had been raising cattle for longer than most white settlers realized, adapting European livestock to American conditions through patient observation and selective breeding. They even brought food, not just the simple rations that Ezra had expected, but a variety of supplies that demonstrated the sophisticated knowledge Apache people possessed about desert survival. There were dried meats that could last for months without spoiling, ground meal made from desert plants that Ezra had never thought were edible, and preserved vegetables that retained their nutritional value long after harvest. But more than the physical improvements, they brought something that Ezra had lost years ago: hope. These people worked with a joy and efficiency that spoke of communities where everyone mattered, where helping your neighbor wasn't a burden, but a privilege that strengthened the entire group. They sang while they worked, traditional songs that seemed to make the labor lighter and more meaningful. Their children played around the work sites, their laughter echoing across the valley like music that had been absent for far too long. The Apache boy who had started it all, whose name was Little Wolf, stayed close to Ezra throughout the 3 days. Despite the language barrier, they developed a friendship that transcended words. Little Wolf helped with the lighter work, and in the evenings he would sit by Ezra's fire and listen to stories told in a language he couldn't understand but somehow seemed to follow anyway. Chief Standing Bear explained the situation as they worked. My grandson became separated from our group during the storm. He wandered for 2 days without food or proper shelter. When he found your cabin, he expected to die. Instead, you showed him kindness that our people will never forget. Ezra learned that the Apache were facing their own struggles. The reservation system had displaced them from their traditional lands, and conditions on the government reservations were often harsh and demeaning. Many Apache families lived in constant uncertainty, never knowing when new policies might uproot them again or when promised supplies might fail to arrive. We survive by helping each other, Standing Bear explained. When one family faces hardship, the whole community responds. When someone shows kindness to one of ours, we respond as a community as well. You have become family to us, old man, whether you understand it or not. As the war progressed, Ezra found himself learning things about the Apache that contradicted everything he'd been told by other white settlers. These weren't savage raiders or mindless killers. They were farmers and craftsmen, parents and grandparents, people who loved their children and honored their elders, just like any other community. They had sophisticated knowledge of the land, understanding how to find water in the desert, how to predict weather patterns, and how to live in harmony with their environment. On the second day, a group of Apache women showed Ezra how to prepare traditional foods from desert plants he'd never thought were edible. They taught him techniques for preserving meat and storing grain that could help him stretch his supplies through even the harshest winters. They shared knowledge that their people had accumulated over generations, treating him not as an outsider, but as someone worthy of their wisdom. The Apache men worked on his fences and buildings with tools and techniques that were far more efficient than Ezra's traditional methods. They showed him how to build structures that could withstand desert winds and flash floods, how to create irrigation systems that could make the most of limited water, and how to manage cattle in ways that worked with the land instead of against it. But perhaps most importantly, they gave Ezra something he hadn't experienced in years: the feeling of being part of a community. For 3 days, his lonely ranch was filled with voices and laughter, with the sounds of families working together toward a common goal. Children played in his yard while their parents labored, and in the evenings, everyone gathered around fires to share food and stories. On the third evening, Chief Standing Bear sat with Ezra on his newly repaired porch and spoke about the future. "We must leave tomorrow, but this will not be the end of our friendship. You have shown us that not all white men are our enemies, and we want to show you that Apache people can be trusted allies." Standing Bear pulled out a small leather pouch and handed it to Ezra. Inside were seeds, dozens of different varieties that Ezra didn't recognize. These are dessert plants that can grow in this soil and climate. They will provide food and medicine, and they will bring life to this valley in ways you never imagined. Plant them in the spring, and remember that growth comes from the smallest beginnings. As the Apache prepared to leave the next morning, Little Wolf approached Ezra with tears in his eyes. The boy had been practicing English words with some of the adults, and he managed to say, "Thank you, grandfather. I will not forget." Ezra knelt down and handed the boy back the wooden horse he'd left behind 2 days earlier. "Keep this, son, so you remember that kindness travels in both directions." The departure was emotional for everyone involved. Adults who had labored side by side for 3 days embraced like old friends. Children who had played together despite language barriers waved goodbye with obvious sadness. And Ezra, who had lived alone for so many years, found himself crying openly as his new family disappeared over the horizon. But they didn't stay gone forever. Throughout that winter, which turned out to be one of the mildest in years thanks to the Apache weather predictions, small groups would appear at Ezra's ranch, always bringing something useful and always staying just long enough to ensure he was managing well. During the worst cold snaps, when the temperature dropped below freezing for days at a time, Apache families would arrive with loads of seasoned firewood, cut from trees they knew would burn hot and clean. When hunting was good and Apache hunters had taken more game than their families could use, they would bring fresh meat to Ezra's cabin. Venison from deer that had been hunted with traditional methods, rabbit and quail that had been trapped with techniques that ensured sustainable populations, and sometimes even bear meat from the rare occasions when Apache hunters encountered the great animals in the mountains. They brought news from the outside world during the long periods of isolation that winter imposed on desert dwellers. Through the Apache communication network, which was far more sophisticated than most white settlers realized, Ezra learned about events happening hundreds of miles away. Political developments in the territorial capital, weather patterns that might affect spring planting, and news about other ranchers and their struggles with the harsh conditions. The Apache visitors never stayed long, understanding that their presence might cause problems for Ezra if the wrong people saw them. But they always left him feeling less alone in the vast desert that had seemed so hostile for so many years. These brief visits became the highlights of Ezra's winter, giving him something to look forward to during the long, dark nights when the wind howled through the mountains and the cold seemed to seep into his very bones. In the spring, Ezra planted the seeds that Standing Bear had given him, and the results were miraculous. Desert wildflowers bloomed in colors he'd never seen. Food plants flourished in soil he'd thought was barren, and medicinal herbs grew in abundance. His valley transformed from a harsh, unforgiving landscape into something approaching paradise. Word of the unusual friendship between the old cowboy and the Apache spread throughout the territory, and it began to change how other people thought about the possibilities for peace between cultures. Ezra's ranch became a meeting place where Apache and white settlers could trade goods and information without fear or suspicion. It wasn't a large-scale solution to the conflicts that plagued the region, but it was a beginning. Other ranchers began visiting Ezra to learn about the Apache farming techniques that had transformed his land. Some came skeptically, expecting to find that the old man had lost his mind, but they left impressed by the practical wisdom of indigenous knowledge. Slowly, other friendships began to form, other bridges began to be built. Ezra lived for another 12 years after that transformative winter, and they were the happiest years of his life. His ranch prospered not just economically, but socially, becoming a place where people from different backgrounds could meet and learn from each other. Little Wolf visited regularly as he grew into a young man, and eventually he brought his own children to meet the old cowboy who had saved his life with a can of beans. When Ezra died peacefully in his sleep in 1896, his funeral was attended by more than 300 people representing every culture and community in the region. Chief Standing Bear, now an old man himself, spoke at the service about how one act of kindness had created ripples that spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. This man proved that the human heart recognizes no boundaries, Standing Bear said. He showed us that true wealth comes not from what we keep for ourselves, but from what we give away. His legacy will live on in every act of kindness between our peoples. Ezra's ranch was preserved as a meeting place for generations after his death, and the story of the lonely cowboy who gave his last meal to a stranger became a legend that parents told their children to illustrate the power of compassion. The seeds that Standing Bear had given him continued to bloom every spring, a living reminder that the smallest acts of love can create beauty that lasts long after we are gone. The wooden horse that Little Wolf had treasured as a child was eventually passed down through his family and still exists today, displayed in a museum that tells the story of cooperation between cultures in the Old West. Next to it is a photograph of Ezra and Little Wolf taken shortly before the old cowboy's death, showing a white-haired man and a young Apache warrior standing together in a field of desert wildflowers, proof that friendship can bloom even in the harshest landscapes. Today, historians point to Ezra Whitmore's story as an example of how individual acts of courage and compassion can change the course of history. In a time and place marked by conflict and mistrust, one old man's decision to share his last meal with a hungry child created a legacy of peace that lasted for generations. It reminds us that we all have the power to plant seeds of kindness, even when we think we have nothing left to give.